Hola gente de YouTube, yo soy Katita Williamson de este canal Yo Soy Pachamamista y estoy muy contenta porque hoy día estoy compartiendo con el mundo la entrevista que hice con Jay Feldman sobre las grasas omega 3. Tengo otra entrevista con él que grabamos el año pasado. Voy a poner el link de esa primera entrevista debajo de este video. Y ojalá disfrutes mucho este video, esta entrevista sobre las grasas omega 3, pues él está presentando otra perspectiva. Tal vez no hayas escuchado esta perspectiva porque se habla mucho, tanto en medicina convencional como en medicina holística, se habla mucho de las grasas omega 3. Entonces estamos agregando otra voz a la conversación. Y bueno, te animo a mirar la entrevista completa, a entrenar el cerebro para como mantener su atención por más tiempo. Es muy importante, creo que mirar videos y terminar videos largos en este mundo moderno en que hay tantos videos tan cortos. Entonces te animo mucho a mirar la entrevista completa y comentarnos debajo tus preguntas. Y también te animo a visitar mi página yosepachamista.com. Tengo muchos recursos y cursos y blogs y muchas cosas bonitas en mi página. Entonces nos vemos ahí. Muchas gracias, gente. Disfruta la entrevista con Jay Feldman. Hello and welcome to the Yo Soy Pachamamista YouTube channel. We are back with Jay Feldman. Jay is a leading figure in the bioenergetic nutrition space. I had the pleasure of interviewing Jay about 6 months ago. If you haven't heard that interview, it's a great one and it's important to listen to. So I'm going to drop that link below this video. Today, we are going to be discussing omega-3 fatty acids, and it's quite a controversial topic. I think the bioenergetic pro-metabolic perspective is different from mainstream naturopathic medicine perspective. So we're gonna get into the nitty-gritty of omega-3s, and I wanted to start off by saying that it's super interesting. The landlord to my house here in the Appalachian Mountains of East Tennessee, he's an older man in his 70s. He is not well versed in nutrition topics. And one day I was eating sardines. We were fixing up this house so I could move in. And he said something about, oh, yeah, those omega-3s are really good for you. And I thought, wow, isn't that so fascinating? Someone like this man who doesn't really know much about nutrition, because that's not been his area of focus in his life. Even he associates omega-3s with health. And I think the purpose of our talk today is to kind of dive into um, that hypothesis. Are omega-3s really as good for our health as so many people say? So, Jay, thank you so much for your time. I'm so grateful to have you back here. And maybe you can start by responding to what you think about my neighbor knowing about omega-3s and also telling us what an omega-3 fatty acid is.
Yeah, absolutely. It's a great place to start. And, it's pretty notable, right? That omega-3s are one of the few areas in the kind of alternative health space that have gone more mainstream, where pretty much everyone's aware of it. And if you were to ask somebody on the street, what are maybe some of the top things you should do for your health and some of the top things you could take, they might say something like drink a lot of water, um, maybe decrease carbs. I mean, that's pretty popular, among the mainstream right now. But then I think omega-3s would be right up there. And there's not a lot of other things that fit in that category that have really crossed over. And especially also for it to be one that's suggested sometimes by medical practitioners if someone has cardiovascular disease or dementia or something like that. So it's pretty widespread. And obviously we'll be talking about the fact that maybe we want to reconsider those recommendations. But yeah, as a starting place, I think discussing what omega-3s are is a good place. And so basically we have, in terms of the all of the types of fats that we could consume, there's technically four types. There's saturated fats, monounsaturated fats, polyunsaturated fats, and then trans fats. And so omega 3s fall inside the polyunsaturated fat camp. There's two primary polyunsaturated fats. There's omega 6s and omega 3s. And omega 6s are the ones that are mostly found in the seed and vegetable oils, which of course have, are quite popular, infamous these days as something that maybe we want to avoid. And the omega 3s instead often are known as something that comes in fatty fish. That's going to be the primary source, but there are also some omega 3s in nuts and seeds as well. And the idea is that while the omega 6s are generally known to be a little bit more inflammatory and cause some issues potentially in larger amounts, that's kind of the mainstream idea, more or less, but especially in the alternative sphere, it's like the omega 3s are very much bad, avoid them, they're inflammatory. The omega 3s are considered to be kind of the opposite counterparts, where they have the opposite effects of the omega 6s. They're supposed to be anti inflammatory. And as long as you're getting enough omega 3s, it actually helps to balance out the omega 6s and protects you against them. And so we really want to make sure we're emphasizing the omega 3s. The more that we have, the better off we are in terms of cardiovascular health and brain health and general inflammation. And so that's kind of the broad overview here. And I think one other thing that's helpful to consider is where omega 3s come from in nature, and this will become, I think, more relevant as we dig into what happens when we consume omega 3s and how they work with our biology and the biology of other animals. But in nature, omega 3s and omega 6s for that matter, they're cold temperature fats. And so what I mean by that is if we take fish, for example, which are in generally colder waters, or we take those cold water fish, those are the ones that tend to have much higher amounts of omega 3s and much lower amounts of the other fats. And the reason for that is because if you think of something like butter or coconut oil that are very saturated, those are saturated even at room temperature. And if you make them colder, they're really hard and solid. And you can imagine that if a fish was made up of those types of fats, they might not be able to function so well. The part of your body that needs to be like liquid and fluid becomes solidified. And so they need to have these fats that instead are very fluid and liquid. We can see that in the vegetable oils. We can see it in the fish oils. Those ones tend to be liquid, and they function better at low temperatures. They're very sensitive to temperature. They can get damaged very easily, as we'll discuss. And so with that in mind, in nature, we tend to see them in low temperature environments where that damage is much less likely, and they allow for organisms to function in those low temperatures. Again, that's normally going to be the fatty fish. And then you do see it with nuts and seeds as well, which they have to basically make it through a cold winter or, a cooler spring alive in order to be able to germinate later on. And so they have to be able to survive at low temperatures as well. And so that's maybe a good kind of broad overview.
Yeah, that's totally fascinating. So, what we're saying is cold water fish are going to have higher levels of omega 3s than fish found in a river in the tropics.
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
Mm.
absolutely. And if you take fish that are in the warm water and you move them to cold water, they'll increase their omega 3 content and vice versa. If you take the fish from the colder water and move them to warmer water, they'll decrease the amount of omega 3s. And you see the same thing with seeds too. If you take the seeds and the same seeds, bring them to warmer temperature, they have less omega 6s and omega 3s. If you put them to colder temperature, they increase those amounts. So there's a function for these in biology, but we'll discuss whether it's a good function for us and our biology.
Right. That's interesting because historically, for most of human history, people that had access to cold water fish were people who lived in cold climates, and people who had access to warmer water fish were living in warmer climates. So nowadays, somebody in Ecuador, for example, could technically import salmon from Alaska and eat that salmon to get their omega 3s. And I've seen in Latin America, I've seen salmon from northern climates sold, but I it's eating locally. There's also like a physiologic reason, even from the food's perspective. I don't know what the implications are of being a warm weather person and consuming a food from a cold weather environment really far from you, I don't know if that level of omega-3s would be necessary for you. I guess omega-3s were traditionally more accessible to the people who lived where those foods were abundant. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does.
Mm.
And that is what we see. So one of the better examples that's cited for high omega-3 diets naturally is the Inuit and the Eskimos, or way up north, northern Canada and Alaska, and maybe some other areas around there. And they eat, seal and whale blubber, and they have very high omega-3 diets. And you could make the argument that that helps them slow their metabolic rate, which we'll talk about, in a cold environment, which can be a good thing. Basically, that we produce less energy and create more heat, and that can help us survive in those kinds of environments. And that the fish do the same thing. So as they increase their omega-3s, they tend to be less active, and they have a less efficient metabolic rate that allows them to produce more heat and less energy. So there's a trade-off there, which you could say is a good thing if you're going to live in a very cold environment, especially without the luxuries of modern life. But there's an inherent trade-off there. There's a cost to the amount of energy that we can produce. And that comes to the question of, is that a trade-off that we want to be making? But maybe we'll circle back to that.
Yeah, because I think somebody would hear what you just said and say, wait, what? Omega-3s slow the metabolic rate? How can that be possible if they are supposed to help our health? So maybe we go into that. So when people talk about omega-3s being healthy, I haven't heard most people talk about their relationship to the metabolic rate. I think what most people say is they're anti-inflammatory, which someone
Mhm.
might assume, oh, well, if it's something's anti-inflammatory, it's going to increase the metabolic rate. So what are the benefits that mainstream medicine and mainstream naturopathic medicine, what are the benefits of omega-3s that they talk about? And then are those actually benefits or what's really happening there?
Mhm. Yeah. Yeah. So the main area that's pointed to as far as this main differentiation between omega-6s and omega-3s is basically not the fats themselves, but what they convert into. So we have these certain enzymes that act on the fats and convert them to downstream metabolites called eicosanoids. And this is the area that most people focus on, because what's generally known is that the omega-6 fats produce eicosanoids that are generally inflammatory and known to be inflammatory. And then the omega-3 fats are shown to produce eicosanoids that are considered to be anti-inflammatory, and they have the opposite effects of the omega-6s. So one thing that's really important to note is that this is not the only thing that happens with omega-3s and omega-6s. And in fact, I would say it's considerably less important than the other things that go on with these fats. So I think we're excessively focusing on this one area and missing all these other things that happen with these fats. So that's one consideration. The other is that categorizing it as inflammatory and anti-inflammatory is not encapsulating entirely what's going on. So it's true that the omega-3s do have an anti-inflammatory effect, but the way that they tend to do that is through basically immunosuppression. They tend to decrease the activity of various immune factors, and this includes like our T cell functions, our T helper cells, and things like that are integral to our immune system. And our immune system is a mediator of inflammation. So it's kind of like the immune system. It's like the firemen that are trying to put out the fire. It's the police. It's like, some sort of um, system that's supposed to help when there's some sort of an emergency, some sort of damage or irritation. And the omega-3s aren't stopping the damage or irritation. They're just stopping the response to it, in this case, from the immune system. And so it shows as anti-inflammatory, but at the same time, it also creates an immunosuppressive effect. And we see that play out as well. For example, omega-3s are used for allowing the immune system to turn down when there's transplants, like kidney transplants and grafts of tissue from one person to another, where normally the immune system looks at that as a foreign tissue and attacks the transplanted tissue. But if they provide the omega-3s, it turns off the immune function, turns down the immune system so that it doesn't have that attack. And we see it as well with something like infection. You have less of a response to the infection. You might actually see less inflammation if you're taking omega-3s, but the damage from the infection actually ends up getting worse. And in the long term, there's worse outcomes, more susceptibility to the downstream effects of infection. So the idea that they're anti-inflammatory and therefore beneficial, I think, is questionable in the first place. But then I would also say this is a relatively minor role of the omega-3s and omega-6s compared to their other roles, and those are even more telling as to why we might want to avoid or at least reconsider adding extra omega-3s.
Interesting. What are those other roles? Because as you said, it's a little bit too simplistic to say omega-6 bad, omega-3 good. They're both polyunsaturated fats, and we hear now in the mainstream, we hear people talk about, well, polyunsaturated fats are bad because they can easily go rancid, and people will say that about corn oil or soy oil, but then they'll be taking a bunch of fish oil, and so that's that's the issue. If we're gonna lump together polyunsaturated fats and talk about how they are susceptible and vulnerable to light and to heat and to rancidity, etc., then the same is true for omega-3s.
Yeah, and it's true even more so because what contributes to so to even back up a step further, I would say the other primary thing that happens with the fats that we eat is that they become a part of all of our cells, all of our tissues. Um, Fat is an important structural component in every single cell and in our organelles, all sorts of things. And so the fat that we consume literally becomes us, like it gets integrated into the structure of all of our tissues. And there can be a pretty large difference if we're consuming, saturated versus monounsaturated versus polyunsaturated fats. And that difference largely comes down first to stability. And that stability determines how susceptible they are to damage and also how solid of a structure they are. If you're building your house, do you want something solid and impervious to, uh, issues from exterior, wind and rain and all of that, or do you want something that's a lot more flimsy and will allow things to come through? And so that's the kind of question that we want to come to when it comes to the types of fats. And so what differentiates the unsaturated fats versus the saturated fats is the number of double bonds they have and the amount of how saturated they are with hydrogens. This is kind of the chemistry of it. It's not, it's kind of it's not particularly important other than the idea that the double bonds make the fats susceptible to damage. It allows them to interact with other things in a highly reactive way. It makes them very flammable, so to speak. If there's a lot if they're near a fire per se, it's like using, we'll get into some examples about like structure, but in any case, so these polyunsaturated fats, they're much less stable. That's why we see them at liquid at room temperature. That's why they'll get damaged very easily from air, from light, from heat. So we want to be very careful if we're storing them. They're supposed to be stored in a dark bottle in a cool place, or else they will go rancid and they will become damaged. Now, when we consider what happens internally when we do consume these things and they go through our digestive system and then they get integrated into the structure of all of our cells, we aren't very cold temperature fish, right? And fish are not generally not endothermic. So that means that they don't produce their own body heat. So they're generally functioning at a very low temperature. And then if they're in cold water, that's a really, really low temperature. We're about as far from that as you can get, right? Our bodies function at ideally, 98.6 degrees Fahrenheit, 37 degrees Celsius. And that's obviously a high temperature, and there's a lot of activity going on. Our bodies are very, very metabolically active. And so we are, even if we have the best quality polyunsaturated fats, the best quality seed oils or the best quality fish oils that are perfectly intact before we consume them, we're then introducing them to a really reactive environment where they're going to be very, very susceptible to damage. And so this is where the biggest concerns come in. And just to kind of get an idea of how susceptible these fats are to damage, if we look at the omega 3s, there are two primary omega 3s that are uh, suggested to be the main healthy ones. Those are DHA and EPA. And if we compare those in terms of their susceptibility to damage compared to a monounsaturated fat, so not even the most stable, not even the saturated fats, but let's say we're comparing it to the main fat in olive oil, which is oleic acid. If we compare EPA to oleic acid, EPA is 240 times more susceptible to oxidative damage compared to oleic acid. And if we look at DHA, it's 320 times more susceptible to oxidative damage compared to oleic acid. So, we're not just talking like 50% more or something. This is massive, massive differences in terms of how susceptible these things are to damage. And when we eat these things, we're talking about integrating them into every single cell of our bodies in greater amounts. And so that's really where we want to put our focus. And, we can dig into some more detail here about how we see this play out when we consume more omega 3s, what it actually leads to, and how this affects not just humans, but you see this across all species in the animal kingdom, where the more polyunsaturated fats we have in our structure, and the more unsaturated they are, so the closer to the like the more double bonds they have, which the omega 3s have more double bonds than the omega 6s. So these are like the most unsaturated. The more of those we have across all species, the shorter we live, the faster we age, and the more damage we have, the more lipid peroxidation, the more damaged fats we have, which also is a main correlative factor when it comes to aging and lifespan.
That makes sense. So polyunsaturated fats, omega 6s and omega 3s, we know are susceptible to damage outside of the body. And what you said is that even if we ingested the most perfect, pristine omega 3, that's being introduced into our body, which is a highly active, hot environment. And so there will be uh, oxidative stress or can we define oxidative stress versus lipid peroxidation? Like when we are consuming an omega 3, introducing that very delicate fat into our hot body, um,
Mhm.
what happens is lipid peroxidation. Is that correct? Hola, yo soy mi propio sponsor. Entonces te quiero compartir que muy pronto empieza el curso de menopausia y si quieres participar es un curso muy útil para cualquier mujer de cualquier edad que quisiera saber más sobre la optimización de la salud hormonal de la mujer. Entonces visita mi página yo soy pachamista.com para saber más del curso y si no es el momento si el curso no está disponible, pues tengo otros cursos porque el curso de menopausia se abre solo en ciertos momentos del año. Entonces visita mi página yo soy pachamista.com para aprender más de los cursos que tengo para ti. Muchas gracias y vamos otra vez a la entrevista. Bye bye.
Yeah, so it's a great question. So oxidative stress is kind of the broader umbrella term of basically the process of transferring electrons and creating unstable um, molecules that are highly reactive. And these can damage the proteins, our DNA, the structure of our cells, everything. When we have oxidative stress interacting with a lipid, with a fat, it creates a lipid peroxide or lipid peroxidation. So lipid peroxides or lipid peroxidation is just fats that have been oxidatively modified. They've been introduced to oxidative stress. And the reason why this is important is because among different forms of oxidative stress, there are types that are more dangerous, more harmful, and types that are less harmful. And when the fats get damaged, it's really, really problematic. It's like a major amplifier to the oxidative stress environment. So it's like one thing if trying to think of an example here, like again, kind of using this house analogy and what we're using for the structure. It's one thing if there's a fire inside the house and the a table is burning or there's like a blanket that's burning. It's another thing if the actual structure of the house goes up in flames. And that's kind of what we're talking about here when we're talking about the lipid peroxidation.
Okay. Someone might hear this and say, well, doesn't everything oxidize in the body? Is there's always just as a byproduct of our metabolism, we experience oxidative stress, correct?
So, yes, in very small amounts. Like if things are functioning well, there's always going to be some, but it should be small. And we've got a lot of ways to keep that in check. We have antioxidant systems, really expansive ones that are meant to keep things in balance there so that we can handle not only small amounts on a regular basis, but if there are moments of large amounts, we can clear that out. And that's why lipid peroxidation in a moment doesn't kill us. It doesn't like immediately cause disease. We have ways of handling it. But on an ongoing basis, the more of that we're exposed to, the more we're depleting ourselves with that antioxidant system, and the more um, the more we're going to move toward degeneration.
Years ago, I heard Chris Masterjohn talk about polyunsaturated fats. He was talking about omega 6s rather than omega 3s, I believe, but he was saying that for the average modern person, because we're so overexposed to these polyunsaturated fats, it would take something like 4 years to clean out your cell membranes of those fats and restore the structural integrity of a more saturated fat. I guess not purely saturated, of course, but a more
Mhm.
saturated cellular membrane of the cells across your body. That it would take something like 4 years to essentially purge from your cell walls or cell membranes these polyunsaturated fats. Is they I guess you're I mean, you mentioned that before, what we eat literally becomes us. So these fats literally become part of our structure. And if you switch your diet from a more polyunsaturated diet to a more saturated diet, it takes a while for that structure to kind of replace itself. Is that right?
Yes, although it depends on where we're looking. So if we're talking about, yes, changing the entire, like every cell membrane, every cellular structure in the whole body from, a high PUFA diet to a low PUFA diet and seeing that change be reflected, it can take 2 to 6 years. It kind of depends on some specifics, one of which is how much body fat we have, because the body fat is one of the last ones to change over. It takes a long time. If we're not, it's not like our body fat stores are constantly changing over. There's small amounts of release and small amounts that get restored. So that's one of the areas that takes the longest. And part of the problem with that is if we have a lot of polyunsaturated fat stored in our body fat, every time that fat gets released, it's like we're eating polyunsaturated fats. We're getting exposed to more, which makes it a bit of a slower process to change everything over. But we do see some changes very quickly. And I would say most changes happen on the order of several months as opposed to years. So you can see changes in, they look at the red blood cell fat content, they look at the red blood cell phospholipid content. You can look at the phospholipid content in the muscles and in the liver. All of those things turn over a lot more. So normally, by like 3 to 6 months, the vast majority of the important tissues have already changed over largely. And it's the adipose tissue that takes the longest. It's the fat tissue, like our body fat, that takes the longest. And that's still, as I was saying, like if you're releasing polyunsaturated fats, it'll slightly increase the amount in those other areas. But most of the changes happen early on, but there are like it will still take time for the body to fully change.
So if someone does switch from a less switch from ingesting a lot of polyunsaturated fats, whether in the form of omega 6s or omega 3s, to a more saturated fat diet, which we're saying is a healthy thing to do,
Mhm.
is that change happens at the tissue level. Overall, what are the changes that we're feeling health wise? Our metabolism is higher. Is that right?
Ideally, yeah. So, as far as things that we might notice on the shorter term, we're kind of like we talked about earlier, the cold temperature versus the warm temperature. We want to see our bodies shift toward more warm temperature functions, meaning a higher metabolic rate, more energy, possibly more hunger and needing to eat more. We're kind of shifting away from hibernation and very slow processes into very much high function. So ideally, lifts in mood and energy and cognitive function, but also potentially hunger and being able to eat more and still maintain your weight, meaning that those engines are working a bit more efficiently. So those are the kinds of things we'd be looking for in the short term. When we're talking about longer term processes that take a long time to develop, you know, cardiovascular issues and plaque in the arteries and um, brain degeneration and liver fat accumulation and like liver fibrosis, those things will start to improve. And in some studies, they do improve remarkably quick by taking out the polyunsaturated fats. But we might find that it takes longer to see the shifts in those processes that take longer to accumulate in the first place. Um, but yeah, we would still want to be seeing in that short term a pretty notable shift, kind of out of hibernation, out of that low, like kind of cold winter metabolism, and toward more of a summer metabolism.
Interesting. I feel like the Inuit, I would think that the Inuit consumed high levels of polyunsaturated fats because of the fish, etc., but also high levels of saturated fats. I mean, they just across the board just had high levels of all fats because whale blubber is probably highly saturated, or seal fat. I mean, I imagine those fats are extremely saturated.
Yeah, so percentage wise, it is still a very high omega-3 and high PUFA diet,
Hmm.
or at least high omega-3 diet, because a lot of those cold water animals have a lot of omega-3s, but they they are on a very high fat, lower carb diet, and also the way that they're living is not the way that most of us are trying to live, like the
Right.
types of things that we're doing, right? They're in general, at least historically, living much simpler lives. And I can't say I know all that much about their lifestyle, but I do know that they're not working 9 to 5 plus jobs and then going to the gym and then trying to deal with the psychological stress of all the things that we deal with in more of the modern culture. And it's worth saying a lot of the Eskimos and Inuit have integrated in and are in more of the modern culture, but just kind of
Mhm.
talking more historically and traditionally. And if we wanted to fully adapt to a cold environment, I think that's kind of, we're talking about a trade-off. That's part of that trade-off that we're making, which is that we're, I would, we're going to be going into more hibernation, less activity, more sleep, um, less stress, all of those kinds of things. And that's not the type of lifestyle that most people are trying to live. If we want to live a hibernating lifestyle, then I do think maybe you could argue there's a place for those things. But um, that's I think most of us are aiming for a different sort of function.
Right. We can't copy the diet of somebody that lives in a pretty extreme environment in a really different place than we live in. Although even where I am in Tennessee, the days are a lot shorter and it's darker, and there's certainly a slowdown in winter. But also, as you said, modern society doesn't really permit us to completely slow down the way that traditionally we probably did. So we can't go into an extremely slow metabolic kind of pace because we have to keep up with what life is asking of us.
Yeah, and this is getting into a much larger question of the development of the human organism. But
Right.
what I would say is that we a lot of what we do is trying to mitigate the effects of winter as opposed to trying to adapt into being winter creatures, right? We aren't bears who are going to hibernate for the winter, or squirrels who at least are going to slow down our activity and get fatten up and everything, because we're not going to be eating much food. We do the opposite. We store food. We've got grocery stores. We bring in food from elsewhere. We turn up our thermostat or throw some extra wood on the wood stove and do what we need to do to try to actually mimic more of a warm
Right.
temperature environment, right? And
Mhm.
and I would say that's not inherently problematic. I don't think we want to fall into this idea of I should do whatever's kind of natural in this environment right now. we'd be, in order to do that, we would have to make a lot of sacrifices in terms of what we want to do with our lifestyle. But also, I think we would be missing out on the potential for further progression and advancement as an organism and kind of complexifying further, which requires more energy, higher metabolism, higher cognitive function. And so I think that's the area that we want to go. And if we're trying to reverse disease and symptoms and kind of get toward optimal health, I think it's especially important that even in a colder environment, we try to mimic the aspects of a warmer environment. And we, ideally we use light bulbs to keep it light even when it's darker. And ideally we can use light bulbs that help to mimic the sun as opposed to ones that are really high in blue light and very low in the red light and infrared. So there's a lot of strategies we can include that help to prevent what I would say are kind of dampening negative effects of a winter environment.
Hmm. Yeah, that's super fascinating because, like you said, we're not physiologically, we're not winter animals. Like you said, we don't we don't go into hibernation. Is even if we were totally relaxed in winter and going to bed when the sun goes down at 4 p.m. or whatever, we're still not hibernating. That's not who we are. We the human species in general has like longed for the opposite of that, which is an acceleration of metabolism and heat and, so that makes sense. That's really interesting. So, okay, so going back to the sixes and threes, another
Mm.
thing that's like super common in to hear in on Instagram and kind of natural health spaces is, well, traditionally, the ratio of omega 6s to omega 3s was more like 1 to 1. And now it's something like 20 to 1, with omega 6s being 20 and omega 3s being 1. And usually I hear people say, well, we can deal with that in two ways. We can lower our omega 6s, so, avoiding processed vegetable oils, and then at the same time taking omega 3s. Do you
Mm.
have any thoughts on this idea that traditionally or historically our ratio of omega 6 to 3s was more like 1 to 1? And was that a good thing?
Yeah, so I do think the ratio was much closer to one than it is now, mostly because we've just dramatically increased our omega-6 intake, as
Right.
opposed to having a diet that largely was saturated in monounsaturated fats. I don't think it was so much because we had this massively high omega-3 intake, and which ties into something I want to mention in regards to that last question, which is that we spent the vast majority of our existence as humans in warm tropical or subtropical environments. It's only been in the last 30, 40,000 years that we've really left those with kind of technology to allow us to survive in colder environments. But in those warmer environments, we're not getting deep cold water fish that have high omega 3s. Generally, this was pre-agriculture, so even if we wanted to eat lots of high omega-3 nuts and seeds, they wouldn't have been available. And in those warm environments, you don't have that. Most of the nuts and seeds are very high in saturated and monounsaturated fats. You can think of cocoa or like shea, that we get shea butter from. Like those kinds of nuts and seeds are much higher in saturated and very low in polyunsaturated fats. So our availability of omega 6s and omega 3s would have been very, very low. And we see that in modern day traditional cultures in those areas. We have examples like the Hadza, the Maasai, the Tokelau, the Puka Puka, and these are all different native cultures that eat close to what their natural diet has been for a very, very long time. And it's generally very, very low in omega 3s, generally very low in omega 6s. And they're perfectly healthy in terms of cardiovascular risk and arguably much more healthy in those regards compared to the kind of Western modern counterparts. So yes, the ratio would have been closer. Kind of coming back to the earlier question, yes, the ratio would have been closer historically, but that's mostly because of much less omega-6 intake, not because of much more omega-3 intake. And I think focusing on the ratio is a little bit missing the point.
Right. Okay. I understand. I think that a, a a lot of people respond to this whole topic of omega 3s as, okay, the first response would be, Well, the real issue are rancid fish oils. Okay, but good fish oils and high quality fish oils are good. Or someone might say, okay, that's one camp. The issue is
Mhm,
rancid fish oils, and the good fish oils are actually doing really good for your body. And then
mhm,
another person might say, actually, the issue is all the fish oils, but fish and sardines and anchovies, these are healthy. So as long as the omega-3 comes in the form of a food, it's going to be more stable. It's going to have the cofactors of other nutrients. It's like a food, and that's okay.
mhm,
Because, for example, in Weston A. Price's book, Nutrition Physical Degeneration, he
mhm,
does write quite a bit about people with access to seafoods being extraordinarily healthy. So, like in, I think it was Papua New Guinea, and there's pictures of these people like tearing open crabs, and in Peru on the coast, they were eating fish eggs and fish and all these things. So,
mhm.
so yeah, I guess would we've talked about some of the issues with omega threes. Are those issues in just rancid fish oils and fish oils in general, including cod liver oil, and or in foods as well?
Mhm. Yeah, great questions. Great, good kind of alternative perspectives to discuss. So, in terms of kind of the worst, yes, a rancid fish oil, which as much as 70% are in some areas, but often it's more like I think 50% of the ones off the shelf are already rancid. Definitely not a good idea, I would say. Like that's as a starting place, um, generally going to be harmful. But the and so I guess like in general we would agree on that. That's something I think
Right,
is generally well agreed upon.
right,
And for one thing, especially in Latin America, like the quality of supplements tends to be a lot lower, a lot less regulated. And so um, I would expect, I haven't seen studies on this, but I would expect the occurrence of rancid fish oil to be much, much higher. Um, but in any case, yeah, so that's a starting place. We don't want it to be rancid. However, we have these studies looking at cod liver oil, looking at fish oil with antioxidants, looking at pharmaceutical grade fish oil, which means that it's tested to confirm that it's not rancid to begin with. They do a test to see how much is already damaged, already oxidized. And we have studies with those things, and what they find is still the same effect that when more of those are consumed, for one, even just getting through the digestive tract causes damage to the fats. But then the more that gets into the bodies, the more lipid peroxidation we see, the more issues we see in terms of mitochondrial function. And yeah, in general, like the same issues that we see whether we're getting it from the kind of natural unadulterated sources versus the more purified sources show up in both cases. So that would be the first comment there, and it, as you said, kind of takes us to that second piece, which is what if we're getting it from natural food sources. And so first thing I'll say is I'm generally not concerned with warm water fish and seafood, and that includes mollusks, shellfish, clams, oysters, mussels, shrimp and crab, and again, the warm water fish. Do they have more omega 3s than you'll find in beef? Generally, yeah, but it's still a pretty small amount. And there's tons of other benefits in there. I mean, tons of vitamins and minerals, and obviously a good protein source and all of that. And those things are great. So I think low fat seafood is a great option. And again, the omega-3 content in there is generally very, very small, even so, as compared to something like fatty salmon, which could have, 15 times as much omega-3s in a serving. So, or maybe not. Yeah, probably about that. So, depending on what we're comparing. But yeah, so that would be the first thought there. And then another thing, when we look at research here, there's some studies that can show benefit with fatty fish, but when they, they look at it deeper, and there's certain studies where they identify the benefit of consuming the fatty fish is just coming from taking out or just coming from what it's replacing. Generally, the people who are consuming the fatty fish, they're eating less like unhealthy foods. But specifically, there's one study, and they identify that the benefit of the fatty fish was just because of reducing processed meats, which is kind of like the worst quality meat that you could possibly get, which also is super, super high generally in omega-6s and all sorts of preservatives and other harmful ingredients. And so that's one aspect. And then the other is fish does generally have benefits, but I would just say that that's because of all the other beneficial things in there, the vitamins, the minerals, and protein, and all of that. And then the things that's replacing, as opposed to the omega-3s in there. And that's part of the benefit of isolating the omega-3s and making sure that they're not damaged and all of that, and then seeing what the effects are. And we can look at that in the short term in humans, right? And they, we see this when they give omega-3s to the healthiest humans, no blood pressure, no high cholesterol, no cardiovascular disease, and we see the increased damage and stress hormones. We see it, when we look at the lifetime of animals, right? We can do a test where we take rats and we give them a high omega-3 diet versus a low omega-3 diet, and we see that it increases the same damaged fat, decreases lifespan, can increase the progression of fatty liver disease and all sorts of things. So, and it's worth mentioning too, I know we've been talking kind of vaguely about these lipid peroxides and these damaged fats, but just to touch on that a little bit, you can look up any chronic health condition and these fats, and there's a strong relationship. Whether we're talking brain issues like Alzheimer's and Parkinson's and MS, or if we're talking heart disease and atherosclerosis, or if we're talking infertility on the male side or the female side, if we're talking endometriosis, if we're talking fatty liver disease, pretty much any chronic disease process you can think of involves the damaged fats. And that's for two reasons. One is because these are states of greater inflammation, greater oxidative stress. So the fats there are going to be more damaged. And on the flip side, the more of the susceptible fats that we consume, the more inflammation and oxidative stress we're going to have. And so there's this kind of bidirectional relationship there. And this is something that influences every aspect of our health.
Mm. So, where would someone go about researching this? Do you have you have several podcasts about omega-3s? Maybe in your show notes there are a link to some of these studies. I'm only saying that because I can imagine it's just so ingrained in so many people's brains that omega-3s are healthy. You need a lot of them. They're anti-inflammatory, they're good. I think that some people might appreciate being like, "Hey, I'm going to go look at the study myself."
Mm-hmm.
Are most of these studies done with pharmaceutical grade isolated omega-3s? There's not, is that what people use in the studies? Are most of them rat studies?
So there's a combination. There's studies on different animals. A lot of times the animals are rodents, it's mice and rats.
Right.
And then there are studies on humans. Some of them are using standard fish oil, some are using cod liver oil. Some test the fish oils in different forms, like there's the ethyl ester form and the triglyceride form and phospholipid forms. And um, there's some studies where they include antioxidants with it, some studies where they do the pharmaceutical grade, and they look at healthy situations and unhealthy situations and what happens when you increase stress and what, just as a kind of preview there, if you provide the unsaturated fats and then you cause mild stress, exercise or fasting in humans, or in rodents, it increases you have more damage to the fats relative to the groups that didn't have those fats. So there's a number of lines of evidence. The unfortunate thing with science and research is that with humans, there's so many variables we can't control for, and we can't do super long-term studies of, you can't take somebody from the time they're born until, 80 years old or whenever they die and give them two different diets, and they have to eat this one, they have to eat one diet and this other group has to eat this other diet, and everything else in their
Right.
life is controlled. They get the same amount of exercise and everything else is the same. We just don't have that capacity. We can look at shorter term studies like that in humans, but then when we look at other animal models is when we can see the sort of longer term effects in a very, very controlled environment. So uh, there's pluses and minuses to both sides of the research, but when we in some of those podcast episodes we go through all different lines of evidence there, and it all generally points in that same direction. And sometimes there are situations in research where we can't extrapolate from animal models to humans. Like there are certain differences that are really important, certain differences that we need to consider in terms of, certain enzymes that one animal has over another, or certain aspects of physiology that are very different. With the polyunsaturated fats, that doesn't really seem to be the case. And in fact, this is one of the most universal things that we see across all species. So there's this what's called the membrane pacemaker theory of aging, which is put forth by a researcher by the name of Holbert. And they basically looked at the amount of unsaturation in the cells and the tissues of all animals that we can get data on, which is obviously tons. And basically, what they find is there's this really, really strong correlation between how unsaturated the membranes are, how susceptible they are to damage, and lifespan and aging. So the animals that have the least unsaturated fats in their structure live the longest, and the ones that have the most live the shortest. And we see this, for example, um, we could consider, I mean, they look at rabbits and pigs and horses and sheep and humans and like every animal you could think of. But, you know, it used to be thought that the rate of aging had to do more with how fast the metabolic rate was. But there's many, many exceptions to that rule. And they found that what correlates the best, what seems to be the most direct driver here is how unsaturated the fats are. And we find that between species. So if you look at a rat that lives 4 years versus a pigeon that lives around 35 years, the pigeon has way less unsaturated fats inside their cells. And then if you compare that to a human, we live 78 years on average, because depending on where you live, we have even less. And that's just determined by us as a species. But then if you take that same species, like a rat, and you feed it less or more unsaturated fats, that affects the lifespan within that range. So you're never going to get a rat that lives for 78 years. But if you compare rats that generally have this range of lifespan and this range of unsaturated fats in their membrane, the more unsaturated fats you give them, the less long they live, and vice versa, and all these other issues that come about. So yeah, there's a lot of research to dig into, and I'd highly recommend that people do so, and take a look at these things, because you're right. We're flipping a truth on its head, for many people. So
Mhm. So definitely come from the Weston A. Price world. The foundation recommends really high quantities of cod liver oil. In fact, I was around back in 2015 when there was a big controversy. I don't know if you've heard about that controversy. The vice president of the foundation at that time had come out with a report on the green pastures fermented cod liver oil, saying that it was
mm,
rancid and was causing really big issues, and that she had, everyone in the foundation had turned kind of like, and turned their heads and didn't want to hear it, because green pastures has always had a relationship with the foundation. It was very, very, very controversial, and a lot of people kind of left the foundation. But her whole point was, you can't ferment cod liver oil, you just make it rancid. And it turned out that the cod liver oil that they were marketing wasn't actually cod, it was pollock, which is very similar to cod, but it's not cod. And so you can't call it fermented cod liver oil if it's fermented pollock liver oil. So I guess it's just interesting to me, because over the years I've gone to their conferences sometimes, and I talk to people who do follow the recommendations of their cod liver oil, and specifically fermented cod liver oil suggestions, and they're just so high. It's remarkable. And I think to myself, well, are they seeing benefits because of the vitamin A in there, because of the vitamin D, maybe some iodine as well? Also, the Weston A. Price population, people who follow that dietary philosophy, are absolutely avoiding omega-6s and are absolutely prioritizing saturated fats, tallow and lard, which is monounsaturated as well, but tallow and lard and butter. So maybe their high dosing of fish oils, or specifically cod liver oil, doesn't do as much damage as it would to a general population. But anyway, it's just a very fascinating topic because a lot of things that the foundation speaks about, I'm on board with, but I just can't get on board with what they recommend in terms of cod liver oil. It's a massive amount.
Yeah. Yeah. And, it's worth mentioning, a lot of the ideas there are coming out of what Weston A. Price found when he was looking at all these different cultures. And I don't know of any that were doing fermented cod liver oil. Um, but
Yeah. Yeah, I don't know how you do that. It just becomes rancid.
yeah. And look, it's true that, as you mentioned, there are great nutrients in cod liver oil, like vitamin D and A and K2, and those things are great. I would say let's just get those from a different source that is stable. Um, yeah.
Right. And he did, I guess the reason why this green pastures product exists and they call it fermented is because in his book, although he didn't talk about finding it in an indigenous population, he does talk about helping a young boy whose health was really bad and giving him, for he says, fermented cod liver oil, high vitamin butter oil,
Mm.
and meat organs and shellfish and raw milk. So he does mention that. I guess I don't know exactly what product he used, but um but yeah, it's very interesting. And I guess that it's also just the mind component as well. If you really, really trust that that this product is going to help you, then it probably will. Or more, it's more
There-
likely that it will. That's a better
yeah,
way to say
there's
that.
sure. I mean, there's something to be said for that, and the placebo effect is remarkable as well. I mean, people talk about that as if that means that something is ineffective, but the reality is that if you think something's going to be effective, it can have legitimate benefits, like major legitimate benefits. So that's something that's difficult to parse through as well. And that's part of why the research can be really helpful for working through that. But yeah, when it comes to, I mean, we have studies in humans looking at cod liver oil showing that it does increase lipid peroxidation. And we have it looking in other animals as well. And the one thing that's seen pretty universally, I think you mentioned, like if someone is healthy, that maybe that it's going to be even less susceptible to damage, which is true. Someone who's healthy is definitely going to have less general amounts of oxidative stress versus someone who's not, and that will lead to less damaged fats. But if you take those same healthy people and you give them a high omega-3, even a high cod liver oil diet versus the less healthy, and you look at what happens when they experience stress, it directly increases the lipid peroxidation. And they see that in athletes. They look, there's these uh, studies where they provide omega-3s and they look and they see at baseline, there's greater lipid peroxidation. But then also after exercise, there's greater lipid peroxidation relative to the ones who had less omega-3s. And you see it too. There's a study, this one's on rodents, but they look at fasting and same thing. Like there's greater levels of lipid peroxidation at rest, and then even greater amounts after fasting in the groups that get more omega-3s, whether it's fish oil, cod liver oil, or some other version.
I see. So the oxidative stress of adding high amounts of fish oil or high amounts of omega-3 to your diet become amplified when the body's also experiencing other types of stress. It's like stress creates more stress, or stress amplifies stress that's already there, or stress worsens the stress that's already there. Is that right?
Yeah, and it's also like, so we have this again, I come back to the house analogy, but it's like, if we build, like, a house always has to deal with this is getting weird, but anyway,
No,
it's
it's
always
fine.
dealing with some sort of exposure to the elements, right? Wind and rain and whatever else there is. the nature of its existence and existing in nature. There's always going to be some insults we have. We're always going to be going under some stress, but the better the structure is, the more it can withstand that. The weaker the structure is, the more susceptible it is to damage, the more it's going to get damaged when it's exposed to those things. And if we then consider the situation, this is the even, I would say, even worse, we consider the fact that these are suggested for people who are in a state who already have cardiovascular disease or are already in a state where they're seeing excess lipid peroxidation and they're suggested to increase the omega 3s. The fire is already there, and we're just adding super flammable substances to it.
Hmm. Yeah. Yeah. That makes sense. And someone who is really properly nourished, has a highly functioning thyroid, who eats butter and uses tallow, and who avoids vegetable oils and doesn't go out to eat, and et cetera, that person would potentially be able to handle some omega-3s better than somebody who is not as metabolically sound, right?
Yeah, it would definitely cause less damage. But there's another part
Right.
that we haven't talked about as directly when it comes to the structure of the unsaturated fats and the omega 3s. So we talked about
Okay.
them being unstable and susceptible to damage. But the
Right.
other thing here is that these fats are integral to our energy production processes. So the mitochondria are known as the engines of the cell. That's where we're producing our energy. And there's two what are known as membranes inside the mitochondria, or one inside and one outside, and those are made up of fatty structures. So the more omega 3s we're having, the more omega 3s will be inside the mitochondria in those membranes. And the membranes kind of, I mean, the way we produce energy in the mitochondria works kind of like a hydroelectric dam, where we kind of have all this water on one side, and then we have this little wheel in the middle, and we allow the water to just flow through there, and that wheel spins and it generates energy. Now the dam itself, like the wall of the dam where that wheel is, that's made up of these fats. And so the less stable that wall is, the more unsaturated fats are there, and especially the more omega 3s are there, the leakier that wall is. So obviously we don't have this problem so much if we're making that wall out of brick or stone or concrete or something. But in our bodies, they're made of fats, and fats are not perfectly stable, especially the unsaturated ones. And so when those unsaturated ones are used for this hydroelectric dam, it actually allows the water or its hydrogen ions to flow through the wall instead of going through the wheel that we're trying to spin to create energy. So we actually lose out on our ability to effectively produce energy. And instead, what happens is instead of producing as much ATP, we produce more heat. And so this is that trade-off we were talking about earlier. This is potentially good if we're in a really cold environment. We are going to have less ATP, less energy. We slow our bodies down, but we produce more heat so that we can survive that cold environment. But we want to have that energy if we're not sitting out in the snow for all of winter. We need that energy to be able to function. That's the energy that allows for our brain to function, our hormones to be in a good spot, our liver to detoxify, for our body to reproduce and have good fertility, for our gut to function well and digest the food that's coming in. We need that energy for everything that happens. And so the more omega 3s we're consuming, the more that get into the mitochondria and become part of that structure, and the less efficiently we produce energy. And so that's the other really important piece here, that even if they're not damaged, this is assuming no damage to those fats, they're going to interfere with how effectively we produce energy. And if they then get damaged, which is really likely in this high octane environment, this highly oxidative environment where we're producing a lot of energy, if they get damaged, that's even worse for the mitochondria. It basically breaks the engines and prevents them from producing energy. So it's both sides of that coin are really concerning.
Right. And so we want to build our house, our structure, with more saturated fats from the time, hopefully, that we're in utero f- throughout life. And saturated fats would be butter and tallow and coconut oil, especially if we're in the tropics like you are in Ecuador. Coconut oil and lard. Lard is really actually has like a lot of monounsaturated fats. Do you have any if you really look at it, I have the book by Mary Enig, who
Mm.
was a colleague of Sally Fallon, and she wrote Know Your Fats, and it talks about the composition of so many different kinds of fats. And I think lard is actually like 50% or maybe even 55% monounsaturated. Are monounsaturated fats okay? I mean, they're not saturated, but they're also not polyunsaturated. And we do know the famous Mediterranean diet and access to olive oil. I mean, it's funny that like also in mainstream consciousness, we have this idea that the Mediterranean diet is the healthy diet. And I always say, like, God doesn't only love you if you were born in the Mediterranean. Like, God, you know what I mean? So it's not just like olive oil is not the only healthy fat, but it is a healthy fat, but it's not saturated, but it's monounsaturated, which is also good for structure. Is that right?
Yeah. Monounsaturated fats are great. They're not quite as stable as saturated, but they're very, very stable. Again, remember we were comparing earlier, we were talking about the oleic acid, that main monounsaturated fat in olive oil,
Right.
versus the polyunsaturated ones.
Oh,
And we're
yeah.
talking hundreds of times difference in terms of susceptibility to damage. So when we compare to the omega 3s. So yeah, we're fine. I'm fine with monounsaturated fats. Beef fat, lamb fat, those have normally around 40% of their fat coming from monounsaturated. Butter is less, it's more like 20. But if you're using tallow, beef, or lamb tallow, that'll be up in the 40s ish in most cases. As you said, lard is high in monos. Again, I'm fine with that. The bigger concern with lard, when it's coming, we're talking about pigs and their fat, that depends on what they're eating. So, like us, their fat changes a lot more with the food that they eat. With the ruminant animal like cows and lambs, the bacteria help to convert unsaturated fats to saturated fats. So even if they're eating a high PUFA diet, they're still mostly all saturated and monounsaturated with very, very little PUFA. But when it comes to pork and chicken, pigs and chickens, it matters a lot more what they're eating. And so if they're eating corn and soy and oils, then they're going to have very high amounts of PUFA in their fats. And that's a case where those are generally best avoided. So if we have our own chicken and pigs and can feed them low PUFA diets, then lard could be great. Or if we can get it from somewhere where they're feeding good diets like that, or their natural diets, if they're just pastured and the chickens are eating, insects and grubs along with the pigs, they're going to have a low PUFA composition. But if they're being fed all the things that they tend to be fed in the commercial feed, they're going to be very high in PUFA. So that's an important consideration. But yeah, I think it's important to detail the good ones here. So as you said, saturated ones are mostly going to be tallow and butter, so like dairy and beef and lamb and bison, goat, all of those, and eggs. Generally, again, it kind of depends on what the chickens are fed, and then chicken and pork depends on what they're being fed. And then shea butter, which I guess is more used topically, as well as like mango butter, but cocoa is mostly saturated. Palm oil is mostly saturated and very low in PUFA. But that one, there's some environmental concerns. So ideally, you can get it from a sustainable source if you're going to use palm oil.
Mhm.
Um, yeah, coconut and like cocoa butter are both good options too. And the monounsaturated fats, I would say, are fine as well. So that, olive oil and olives, avocado and avocado oil, macadamia nuts, those are a few that are mostly all monounsaturated fat and they're pretty low in polyunsaturated fat. And then generally everything else, margarines, vegetable oils, um, poorly fed or high PUFA fed, chicken and pork, and lard too, if it's high PUFA fed. Those are going to be our main sources of the polyunsaturated fats. And the fatty fish, especially, are going to be really high in omega 3s. And then also a lot of the nuts and seeds, flaxseed and walnuts and things like that. Those are also high in omega 3s. So those would be the ones that we want to minimize.
Right. Pork is so fascinating. It's such a controversial topic. It does seem like if you're going to go to eat, and it's definitely not an organic restaurant, the meat is not from an organic farm, the safest meat to choose would be beef as opposed to chicken or pork because you of what you just described with the ruminant animal versus the pork and the chicken are of omnivorous origin and their fat content could really be high PUFA and probably is 99% likely that it is if it's coming from a conventional factory farm situation.
Yeah, and if we were to choose really lean options for chicken and pork, like chicken breast, for example, there's not too much fat in there. So percentage wise of the fat, it's high in PUFA, but if you're only getting a gram or two of total fat, it's not so bad. So chicken breast could be okay in that case. In that case, I'd be more concerned with what they're cooking it in, because normally
Mm,
it's, even the steaks and everything can be brushed with oil before they're cooked. So
mm,
and what are like this, if you're having starches or vegetables, what are those cooked in? Like that's probably going to be really high sources as well of the polyunsaturated fats. And if you could ask for someone to cook in butter or olive oil, I think that's always best if possible. But yeah, chicken breast can be an okay option if you have to do chicken. And seafood, if we're doing low fat fish and as well as low fat seafood like shrimp and mussels and things like that, those are all very low in PUFA as well.
okay. Um, Great. Well, this was a very enlightening conversation. I think it's really important to bring in the bioenergetic perspective of omega 3s because we usually have to question the things that everybody knows. Everybody knows cholesterol is bad. Ooh, that means we have to question it. Everybody knows omega 3s are good. Ooh, that means we have to look into it. So I think it's really important. I'm really glad that we are going to subtitle this and put it in Spanish because I don't think this is something that's really talked about yet in Spanish. And so I appreciate that. And I'm going to put links to your podcasts about these topics. I'm going to put that below the video. And those podcasts also have show notes that people can explore if they want to further explore the literature around this topic. And I'll also put links to your site. Um, and are there anything that we didn't cover that you think, oh, I really need to say this about omega 3s before we close out? Anything you can
Yeah.
think of?
Well, you mentioned cholesterol, which I think is an important connection here. So again, this idea with cholesterol, the lipid hypothesis is that increased levels of cholesterol in the blood and increased LDL, those are inherently bad. Those are going to cause cardiovascular disease. And that's another place where omega 3s are considered to be really beneficial, is that they lower cholesterol levels, they lower LDL. Now, when we zoom in just a bit as to how they're doing that, it's incredible that this is still recommended as a good thing, because the way that they do this is when the omega 3s get to the liver. The liver is where the cholesterol is kind of packaged and sent out into the blood as LDL or HDL.
Mhm.
When we get omega 3s in the liver, they cause so much peroxidative damage that it damages the proteins, the lipoproteins that are supposed to carry the cholesterol out of the liver, and prevents those lipoproteins from forming and taking out the cholesterol. So what happens is, because of this oxidative damage in the liver, you see less LDL and cholesterol in the blood, which people say is a good thing, but it's coming as a result of liver damage. And at the same time, it's preventing the necessary export of fats and cholesterol out of the liver, which can then contribute to fatty liver disease because you can't export the fats, and can basically contribute to cholesterol deficiency symptoms, because cholesterol is a vital nutrient that we need. And if we can't send it out from the liver, which is generally where we're producing it, then we can have hormone issues, because our hormones are all produced, reproductive hormones are all produced from cholesterol. We can have cognitive issues, since cholesterol is really important for the brain. It's also really important for immune function, which, again, speaking of immunosuppressive effects, if we have a lack of cholesterol being sent out from the liver, that's going to cause immunosuppression. And low cholesterol levels do have been shown to increase susceptibility to infection. So I think that's another really good example here, where if we zoom in a bit below the surface at what we're being told, which is omega 3s are good because they lower cholesterol, and we see what's actually going on underneath it, I think really leads to some questioning of that idea.
That's fascinating. Um, yeah, that's fascinating. Cholesterol is extremely important for brain health, for nervous system health. So we don't necessarily want to lower it. And I think we spoke about this in the first podcast. Higher cholesterol levels are a signal usually to check out what's happening with the thyroid, what's happening metabolically in general with the whole body. So, um, yeah, it's just not as simple as being like, okay, omega 3s lower cholesterol, therefore they are good. So I hope that this podcast sparks some some curiosity in people to keep investigating on the topic. And I really appreciate your time, Jay. And thanks so much for coming back on Yo Soy Pachamamista.
Absolutely. Yeah. Thanks so much for having me again, Katie. And, I know we were talking about some things to avoid and fats that are good. And if people want to have a nice layout of, here are the foods that are best to include, here are the ones to reduce or avoid or minimize, I have that all laid out in the Energy Balance Food Guide, which listeners can download for free at jayfeldmanwellness.com/guide. So that's always a great starting place if we're looking to make some changes here and lower the poof in our diet and do some other things to keep our metabolism up and see other health benefits. So
Okay, awesome. I'll put that link down there as well. And thank you, everybody, for listening. Have a great day. Bye.